Somewhere on the eastern face of the Rock of Gibraltar, there is a doorway that no living person had passed through for 40,000 years. It wasn't buried by a landslide. It wasn't hidden by accident. Someone walked up to it, packed it shut with sand by hand, and left it that way. Then the ice ages came and went. The seas rose, entire species vanished, and still that seal held. When a team of archaeologists finally broke through it in 2021, they weren't just opening a cave. They were opening a message that had been waiting, untouched, since before modern humans ever set foot in Europe. What they found on the other side would end up rewriting one of the oldest assumptions in human history. The site is called the Gorham's Cave Complex, a cluster of four connected caverns, Gorham's, Vanguard, Hyena, and Bennett's, cut into limestone cliffs on Gibraltar's eastern coast. The complex holds UNESCO World Heritage status precisely because it contains one of the densest concentrations of Neanderthal occupation evidence anywhere in Europe, with archaeological layers stretching back, well over 100,000 years. For decades, it has been one of the most important Neanderthal sites on Earth, and the archaeologists who work there, led by Professor Clive Finlayson in the Gibraltar National Museum, have spent years crawling through its passages inch by inch, screening every bucket of sediment for anything that might have been missed. Inside one of the four caves, known as Vanguard Cave, the team had noticed something odd about the back wall for years, a section where the sediment felt different, softer, almost like it was hiding something behind it. It took nearly a decade of careful digging before they understood why. What they eventually uncovered was a narrow gap leading into a chamber roughly 13 meters, or about 42 feet, deep, stretching back into total blackness. The passage had been deliberately packed with sand, and testing showed that sand had sat undisturbed for at least 40,000 years. That meant the chamber itself and everything inside it had to be older still. Nothing had moved in there since before the last ice age reached its coldest point. No animal had wandered through. No water had seeped in to disturb the floor. It was, in the truest sense, frozen in time. Reaching the chamber meant squeezing through a narrow gap near the ceiling, moving carefully with specialized lighting so as not to disturb a floor surface that had not felt a footstep in tens of thousands of years. This was long before the famous painted caves of France and Spain, long before farming, long before anything resembling a settled village existed anywhere on the planet. When the team finally squeezed the gap and shone their lights into space, the air that greeted them was cold, stale, and carried a faint organic smell that some of the researchers said they had never experienced before. It was a smell of tens of thousands of years compressed into complete stillness. The silence, they later described, felt different from ordinary cave silence. There was no draft, no distant echo of the outside world, nothing to suggest that any time had passed at all since the chamber had been sealed. Scattered across the floor were bones. Not human bones, but the remains of a lynx, a spotted hyena, and a griffin vulture, three animals that have no reason to share the same space naturally. Lynxes and hyenas compete for territory rather than coexist. Vultures avoid tight, enclosed places and prefer open sky. Finding all three together, deep inside a sealed chamber more than 60 feet above sea level, did not fit any natural explanation the researchers could think of. Alongside the bones, the walls carried something else. Deep scalloping marks, the kind left by claws dragged with real force across solid rock, evidence that something inside that chamber had struggled violently before it stopped moving. Near the center of the chamber floor, the team found something that, at first glance, looked almost too ordinary to matter. A single whelk shell, the kind of large sea snail that lives in shallow coastal waters. Except the sea snail cannot travel inland on its own. It cannot climb a cliff face. It cannot make its way through a sealed passage and settle at the far end of an underground chamber. Someone had to have carried it there, from a shoreline that, 40,000 years ago, would have sat roughly 4 kilometers away across a wide coastal plain that has since vanished beneath the rising sea. Whoever was walked that whole distance entered total darkness and placed the shell as far from the entrance as the chamber allowed. Because the sand sealing the passage was already established at 40,000 years old, Finlayson pointed out that the only people who could have done any of this were Neanderthals. Modern humans had not yet reached this part of Europe. That single fact turns a whole discovery into something much bigger than an unusual cave. It means a Neanderthal, thinking about something other than food or shelter, chose to bring an object from the sea into the deepest part of a hidden chamber and leave it there. Researchers studying the Gorham's Cave complex have found similar shells elsewhere in the region tied to symbolic or decorative behavior, which raises a possibility that this one carried a purpose beyond the practical. Whatever the exact reason, one thing is hard to avoid. This was not an accident. It was a decision. That idea that Neanderthals were capable of decisions like this has taken decades to earn scientific acceptance, and Vanguard Cave has quietly become one of the strongest arguments for it. In 2024, a separate excavation inside the very same cave turned up something that made the case even harder to dismiss. Buried in an older layer of sediment, dated to somewhere between 61 and 68,000 years old, was a small, carefully shaped pit, barely the size of a dinner plate, with straight vertical walls and two narrow trenches running out from its sides. On the surface, it looked like nothing more than an old fire pit. Under close analysis, it turned out to be something closer to a piece of engineering. Researchers determined that this structure had been used to make tar, a sticky adhesive extracted from resin-rich shrubs like rock rose that still grow across the Gibraltar landscape today. Producing tar this way is not as simple as lighting a fire. The plant material has to be heated to a very specific temperature, somewhere around 150 degrees Celsius, while being almost completely starved of oxygen, because too much airflow burns the resin away instead of releasing it. The team believed the Neanderthals packed the pit with rock rose leaves, sealed it under wet sand mixed with guano to lock in heat, and lit a small, carefully controlled fire of thin twigs on top. The two narrow trenches on either side likely let two people reach in and pull out the softened, resin-soaked leaves before they cooled. To test whether this process actually worked, scientists at the University of Murcia built a replica of the structure using only materials that would have been available in the Paleolithic. Within about 4 hours, using nothing but rock rose leaves, sand, and fire, they produced enough tar to attach 2 stone points onto wooden shafts. That tar was strong enough to be used as a genuine hunting weapon. This method predates similar tar-making techniques by modern humans by tens of thousands of years, and it required exactly the kind of knowledge that cannot be stumbled into by chance. Someone had to first notice that heating certain plants under the right conditions released something useful. Someone had to experiment, adjust the process, and get it wrong more than once before getting it right. And then, crucially, that knowledge had to be taught to someone else, and passed down again and again, long enough for it to survive across generations. A process this specific does not appear in a single lifetime. It survives because a community found a way to keep it alive. If the sealed chamber and the tar pit weren't enough to change the picture, one more discovery inside the same cave complex pushed things even further. Back in July 2012, a team working in Gorham's Cave, just next door to Vanguard, uncovered something carved directly into the bedrock at the rear of the cave, a tight cluster of crossing lines, arranged in a pattern that researchers nicknamed the hashtag. It sat on a small stone ledge more than 300 feet from the cave mouth, covered by an undisturbed layer of sediment containing Neanderthal stone tools. Because that layer was already dated to at least 39,000 years old, the engraving beneath it had to be older still, and old enough that no modern human population had reached Gibraltar yet. Scientists spent years trying to explain the marks away. They tested whether the lines could have come from an animal's claws, from tool sharpening, or from natural weathering of the rock. None of those explanations held up. Laboratory experiments using replica stone points showed that producing a pattern this deep and this deliberate took dozens of careful, repeated strokes, at minimum 54 separate passes with a pointed tool, carved by someone who was right-handed and almost certainly sitting or crouching close to the rock face while they worked. This wasn't a random scratch. It was a result of sustained, intentional effort toward a design that served no practical purpose at all. For most of the 20th century, the ability to create abstract, symbolic marks like this was treated as one of the defining traits that separated modern humans from every other species that came before us. It was used as a key piece of evidence for why Homo sapiens thrived while Neanderthals eventually disappeared. The engraving in Gorham's Cave broke that argument. Here was proof that a Neanderthal sat down thousands of years before any modern human reached that coastline and deliberately created a pattern with no obvious survival value. Whether it meant something symbolic or was simply an act of focused creativity, Researchers still can't say for certain. What they can say is that it was not accidental, and it was not the work of a species incapable of abstract thought. To understand why all of this matters so much, it helps to remember how differently Neanderthals were once viewed. The first Neanderthal fossil to be recognized as something unusual was found in Germany's Neander Valley back in 1856, and for the better part of a century afterward, scientists largely portrayed them as a crude, hunched, primitive branch of humanity, closer to an ape than to us. That image held on for generations, shaping textbooks and museum displays alike. It wasn't seriously challenged until the 1970s, when the out-of-Africa theory proposed that modern humans and Neanderthals were separate, parallel populations rather than one gradually evolving into the other. Then, in 2010, scientists successfully sequenced the Neanderthal genome and confirmed something remarkable. Modern humans and Neanderthals had interbred. Many people alive today still carry small traces of Neanderthal DNA, direct proof that these two groups met, lived alongside each other, and had children together. Other layers within the same cave complex show just how organized that daily life could be. Excavators have pulled out huge numbers of mussel shells mixed with the bones of fish seals, and even dolphins, many of them carrying clear-cut marks left by stone tools. That is not the sign of animals that simply washed ashore and were picked up out of convenience. It points to deliberate hunting and butchering of marine life, meat that was processed and prepared rather than eaten on the spot, which suggests a level of planning and routine that looks a lot more like a home base than a temporary shelter. Add in the sophisticated stone tools, known to archaeologists as Mysterian technology, found scattered throughout the complex, and a much fuller picture starts to form a community that was organized, resourceful, and deeply familiar with the resources around it. Physically, Neanderthals were built differently from us. They had heavier brow ridges, broader chests, shorter and stockier limbs, and on average, slightly larger brain volume than modern humans, though the internal structure of that brain appears to have been organized somewhat differently, particularly in regions tied to language. They made sophisticated stone tools, controlled fire, hunted large and dangerous animals, and survived in some of the harshest climates Ice Age Europe had to offer. Around Gibraltar specifically, they exploited an environment that looked nothing like the coastline of today, a broad plain of dunes, pine forest, and seasonal lakes stretching out toward a shoreline that has since disappeared under the rising sea. And the archaeological record shows they hunted deer and ibex, while also processing seals, dolphins, and shellfish pulled from the water. What the Gorham's and Vanguard Cave complex adds up to is not one single discovery, but a pattern that keeps repeating itself. A shell carried deliberately into darkness, a precisely engineered chamber built to control fire and airflow well enough to manufacture an adhesive from scratch, an abstract design carved with dozens of patient, repeated strokes into solid rock, for no practical reason at all. None of these things happen by accident, and none of them fit the old image of a species too simple to think beyond its next meal. They look, instead, like the work of people who observed, experimented, remembered, taught each other, and occasionally made things simply because they wanted to. For a long time, the simplest explanation for why Neanderthals vanished around 40,000 years ago was that modern humans arrived from Africa, outcompete them, and replace them within a few thousand years. Smarter species in, less capable species out. Case closed. But evidence from Gibraltar has been chipping away at that story for over a decade now. Gibraltar's geography may have helped this particular Neanderthal population hold on longer than most, sheltered on a peninsula at the very edge of Europe, with a rich coastal plain in front of them, right up until rising seas and a changing climate slowly swallowed the landscape that had supported them for so long. If the last Neanderthals really did survive here longer than almost anywhere else, then whatever caused their eventual disappearance likely had far less to do with a simple gap in intelligence and far more to do with the slow, grinding pressure of a changing world. The chamber inside Vanguard Cave is still being studied, and researchers at the Gibraltar National Museum expect the work there to continue for years, maybe decades. Every layer they remove adds another detail to a species that spent most of the last century being underestimated. So the next time you picture a Neanderthal, it might be worth setting aside the hunched, grunting caveman from old textbooks and imagining something closer to the truth, a person who once walked miles along a vanished coastline. picked up a shell for reasons of their own, and carried it into the dark on purpose. A person who understood fire well enough to turn a handful of leaves into a working adhesive. A person who sat at the back of a cave and carved a pattern into rock simply because they wanted to. What do you think that shell, that fire pit, and those carved lines were really for? Let us know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoyed uncovering the story, stay close for more of the mysteries still buried in our past.